The latest summit on climate change is underway. There are representatives of 200 nations assembling for talks on how to implement last year's Paris Agreement on climate change. This meeting will effectively write a detailed rule book, if you will, for implementing that agreement, and that's likely to take about 2 years. It also aims to find ways to raise the hundreds of billions of dollars needed to help developing nations cut their rising emissions and adapt and mitigate the effects of climate change. The Paris Agreement comes into force on the 4th of November after it passed a twin threshold last month of support from 55 nations that represent 55% of global emissions. The Paris Agreement seeks to wean the world off fossil fuels in the second half of the century and in turn limit a rise in average world temperatures to well below 2 degrees Celsius as measured before pre-industrial times.
We all have to be ready for this world challenge and not disappoint the hopes of vulnerable populations. Did we not learn anything by this African proverb? The sun does not ignore a village just because it's small.
Early entry into force of the Paris Agreement is a clear cause for celebration, but it is also a timely reminder of the high expectations that are now placed upon us all. Achieving the aims and ambitions of the Paris Agreement is not a given. We have embarked on an effort to change the course of 2 centuries of carbon-intense development.
All right, then. So the challenge you're facing is how do we move from that carbon-intense development onto something a little kinder, gentler and greener? Let's find out. Uche Okoronkwo joins me live from the Moroccan city of Marrakesh. Uche, good to see you. What exactly is the latest so far from the event?
That's right, Rama. And of course, a lot of expectations are coming with this COP22 event. One of the facts is that it's coming on the heels of the Paris Agreement, the historic Paris Agreement, which of course, as you mentioned earlier, was ratified, was formally brought to about 3 days ago, actually. But anyway, going forward, as you asked, what went on at the conference today? As you saw earlier, we saw the president, the newly elected president of COP22 and Morocco's finance minister, Saladin Mazzoua, open the conference. And he basically cautioned ministers and leaders present to be more ambitious in their commitments going forward. We also saw Patricia Espinosa, who of course is the UN Executive Secretary on climate change. And she highlighted 5 major areas which need to be addressed and of course acted upon going forward. Of course, she mentioned the fact that we needed to discuss the financing of developing countries going forward. She also highlighted 5 other areas, which was the national climate action plans, the support for adaptation, capacity building for developing countries, and of course, engaging non-party stakeholders. So these are some of the 5 areas that we're going to see being addressed as the conference goes ahead.
Let's talk about the Paris Agreement on climate change in a little more detail. It's now in force, but the African states that are present in Marrakesh, are they happy with a deal on the table? Are they happy with the methods by which they will be getting funding that they need for climate adaptation in agriculture, water, sanitation, energy?
Now, of course, the whole world is excited with the fact that this Paris Agreement has formally come into force. But when we talk about Africa specifically, 2 major things to highlight when we look at this deal. One, it does commit richer countries to provide more funding for poorer countries. It also sort of opens up a greater visibility to the areas that need to be implemented in Africa, especially going forward. So those are some of the areas that that pertains to Africa. And of course, it's a positive thing going forward. But it's important to mention that some feel that looking at the commitments, it's a little bit of a high ask for African countries, given the fact that they're still trying to just put together the basic infrastructure needs. So going forward, these are some of the issues that will be addressed at the COP22. It's important to note, of course, that the COP22 is going to be the place that we see that Paris Agreement implemented and sort of cementing the action plan going forward.
Indeed, we'll leave it there for the time being. Thank you for that. That's Jo Koronko, of course, live in Marrakesh. She'll be there for the duration of the conference. You can expect plenty of content coming from her and the team up north.